Hi, welcome back, or I should say I am welcoming myself back. It's been a while. I even doubted whether I could still do this. But I definitely miss doing it, so here I am. I have had the dreaded COVID. After several years of evading it, I finally succumbed. And boy, was I sick for a couple of weeks. There's a nasty one going around. Take care of yourselves, be extra careful. It's not fun. It came also at a very unfortunate time because it separated me from my brand new grandson. That being said, I'm back, and not back in my library or my kitchen. I'm not at home. I was able to travel again to hang out with my daughter and grandson, and I'm feeling much better. My throat is still a little funny, but I thought, I kept putting it off for the last couple of days. I thought, I feel good enough to film, and then I thought, well, I haven't really read much, have I? And I sat down and I sort of made a list of what I'd read. And I realized that actually I read quite a few poems and quite a few journals without really planning to. One thing led to another. So I thought this particular video would be dedicated to a few poems that I really enjoyed in some journals. So if you're thinking maybe of subscribing to a journal, you might, get a bit of a taste, a bit of an appetizer. So I'm just going to check my notes. Firstly, you already know, if you've been playing along, that I subscribed a month ago to Poetry Magazine, which is the American Poetry Foundation magazine, which has just renewed itself with a brand new editor, Adrian Matika. And I would recommend November's edition. Primarily, I would say, for the fabulous, what I call poetry whiplash that it offers the reader. There is a profound change that you'll find between several of the poets, and I can't speak to all of them because I really, I wasn't feeling that well. But what I found most interesting and which stood out to me the most is the change that occurred after reading Tannen Bambrick, who has a poem called "This Breakup Has Me Believing in God," and the following several poems which feature a poet called Will Alexander. So in "This Breakup Has Me Believing in God," it's pretty simple to know exactly what's going on in the poem. It's clear there's been a breakup, there's been some trauma and some heartbreak, etc. Then you come to Will Alexander and you really have no idea. You know that you're somewhere in space, possibly in a parallel universe that he has access to. And you are bombarded with beautiful, strange vocabulary, and you're transported into this other world. And I made a note of something that Will Alexander said in an interview, because of course I was fascinated by his poems and the journal, and so I went looking for a little bit more. And in one of his interviews he says, "I'm not colonized by cognitive expertise." This is a poet after my own heart. He seems to be writing poetry by accessing language that no one else can access. It is his own personal space that he builds within the poems. And in fact, prior to the set of poems in the magazine, there's an introduction in which he is described as a spectrometer, poet as spectrometer. And if you know anything about me, this is what I love most about poetry, because you sit down and you have an intention and you decide to start writing, and things happen. Now, not all poetry is like that, you know. Some people, you know, have an intention, they follow through to the end, and there's narrative structure, and that's beautiful too. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's something otherworldly, strange, weird, for lack of a better word, that is able to transport you sometimes. And Will Alexander is that person. I'll give you an example. Now, I should say I'm going to be linking to all of the poems within the journals that I mention, so that you can play along and read them as you're following this video, if you so choose. There are a couple of poems that are not fully available unless you're subscribed. In which case, you know, there's nothing I can do. But one of the Will Alexander poems, a short one called A Blaze of Riddles, is available on the Poetry Foundation website. I'll give you an example. This is the poem. Because the sun exudes a blaze of riddles, there exists a haze of optimal osmosis, of protracted helium that bends via its forceless gruel, via its maniacal translocation to alien ravines, to other planes and possibilities anterior to the sense of chronicle as uninhabited or pure activity. I find reading that so enjoyable. I feel like it's opening up my world. There's something meditative about it. And to me, it reminds me of a film, actually, of finding yourself possibly in a multi-dimensional world, a virtual reality that he's accessing. He is reading the poem as well here, and also the other poems in the journal. And I should say, it's a surprise. It's a surprise to hear him reading, because firstly, I should say my first reaction was, gosh, he's the worst reader of his own poetry. I mean, he's just shocking. I mean, he stumbles, he mispronounces. I think he not really mispronounces, but he misreads his own work. So he'll switch over a letter and it will be a completely different word, but that word will still work somehow. But then after I listened to him, and he does this with all of his poems, I listened to him for a bit and I thought, actually, I was beginning to like it. And indeed, in one of the interviews with him, he says, I write a poem and once I've worked on it and I feel it's finished, I don't go back to read it. Some of these poems I just haven't ever read out loud or read much at all. And it's almost like he's coming to it fresh and new. He's a remarkable poet. He's been writing for a very long time. And I highly recommend that you look him up. He's a new favorite of mine, indeed. There's the next one. I subscribed to the Paris Review finally. I couldn't resist. And there's a Ben Lerner poem in this month's Paris Review called The Readers. Now, unfortunately, only the first stanza and a half is available to non-subscribers, and I apologize for that. But I simply had to bring it up, because it was so unexpected to find Ben Lerner. Now, the readers in this case are his I guess his daughters, I didn't look it up, but it sounds like he has 2 daughters maybe. And they're old enough now. I know at least one is 8 from what he writes in the poem. And they are showing interest in what he's doing. They're curious about his poetry. And he's writing about what that's like for him. And not only is the subject matter so interesting, because lately I've been very interested in looking at parents who write about parenthood. There's really not that much around, surprisingly. And women who are writing about parenthood usually write extremely dark or highly conceptual poems. And here's a father who's writing a very sentimental poem, really. And I say that with delight, And I'll read the beginning anyway, which you can see. I'll put the link. The Readers by Ben Lerner. Love brought these readers into the world. The cup-like structures of their eyes were formed, inherited color, and love and argument must be conducted differently now that the sounds through the wall are interpreted and a gentle, relentless pressure has been placed on the page. I paid someone to care for them so I could pattern these vowels, and one is 8, and asking me each night to read what I've made. Are you sensing a rhythm? I am too. There's a certain use of meter, which I'm very much looking forward to looking into. There's also a kind of rhyme, not straight rhyme, but there's definitely some rhyming going on. Well, who would have believed it? What an absolutely delightful discovery. A bonus, and available, I believe, for free from the Paris Review, is a set of 5 installments by Sheila Heti called Hello World, transcripts, or so she says, of her written discussions with a type of artificial intelligence that she accesses through some sort of an app. Absolutely fascinating. If you are a Sheila Heti fan, run, don't walk to the Paris Review. It's wonderful to see what she's up to these days. Then I follow Joss Charles on Instagram, and I do recommend, if you have certain favorite poets who are writing today, I suggest to see if they're on Instagram. You'd be surprised how many are. Now, Instagram is, you can use it for good or evil, of course. But in the case of poets, I actually find that's a very good way to find information. What's coming out, what your favorite poet is interested in. And in this case, because I follow Joss Charles, she mentions that she has several sonnets. So already it's like, okay, so Joss Charles is writing sonnets. My ears pricked up. And there's a couple in a journal called Broken Lens. So again, you're being introduced to another journal. Never heard of Broken Lens before. It's a relatively new journal, which looked very interesting. But then there's a series of 5 sonnets in the Sewanee Review. And I was so taken by one of the sonnets. I actually subscribed to the Sewanee Review, and I was not disappointed. Now, the very first of her sonnets in the review is behind the paywall. However, she put the first sonnet, into her Instagram. So if you go to the Joss, I'll leave a link. If you go to Joss Charles's Instagram and you have a look, maybe a week or so ago, the entire poem is there for you to read. So you can read along with me now. So listen to this. It's just titled 1. First, I could not hear you over the woman sounding like the closing of a door. Secondly, the angles in this room are tiny doors. Thirdly, I refuse to speak to you of the doors you knock. When I would not let you in, it's because, fourth, I was full, my feet upon the threshold of a door. Were this likened to a container, then I'd say, fifth, I am a door. But sixth, it would have nothing to do with containment, were we to liken this to a door. Besides, seven, I am empty, a frame. Touch me, you, a door. I love it. And the final one, adore. So why do I say I love it? Because maybe you're thinking, oh, that's just ridiculous. I mean, what does it even mean? And it's like, it just sounds like she put words together. Well, no, it doesn't, because I kind of, I can tell when something is crap or not. And I mean, it's up to you to decide. I mean, maybe you think it doesn't make any sense, but to me, there's a certain buzz in a poem, and it's happened enough times for me to completely trust myself in this. And I know, oh, okay, there's something here, and I'm going to come back to it. And so in the state I was, lying in bed, feeling terribly sorry for myself and rather miserable, physically, I did come back to it again and again, and I sort of, it seemed to kind of expand and contract, and I had, I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated by the architecture of this poem, both its form and its content, because, it talks about the architecture itself. And then by a really sheer coincidence, although I like to think that with poetry there are no coincidences and that there's some poetry god that, is watching over me, but, gosh, that would be very egotistical of me to believe, wouldn't it be? So I came across a website. Now, get your pen and paper out, because you're going to want, if you like poetry, write this down. If nothing else, write this down. VERSE.PRESS, VERSE.PRESS, PRESS. It's this website that contains playlists, and the playlists are lists of poems that are put together by usually by different poets, from what I can tell, for different reasons, and I think they can choose their themes. And I was really excited, actually, because when I went to look up what I had seen before, which was obviously about Just Charles, I saw that one had come out just on the 15th of November. It's a playlist by Kat Fitzpatrick, and I'll leave a link to her. And the playlist is titled, Okay, this is an annotated playlist of narrative verse from circa 1380 to now. And then she writes, I love narrative verse in all capitals. Why can't we have it all? Stories and rhythm and rhyme and whatever we want. Don't believe me? Check it out. And then she has her playlist, which is numbered 1 to 8. And starting with Geoffrey Chaucer, going on all the way to Lord Byron. She's got Eugene Onegin by Pushkin. Number 8 is one of her poems. I love that. I'm definitely going to look that up. But what I originally was interested in talking about in relation to the poem by Just Charles that I just read is her playlist from August 15th, 2018. Find the link down below, on repetition and opacity. Oh man, Just Charles is such an exciting thinker. That's what it is. Really interesting, and you'll never be bored with Just Charles, put it this way. So she talks about how poetry can have a stable eye, the eye of the poem. But then how is that eye working in relation to the reader? And she talks about it in a sense, and I'm paraphrasing probably quite badly, but in the context of power or control. So let's say you are a poet who has certain privileges. Okay, so maybe you're a white cisgender male, let's say, and you're writing with your own intention, as you know a poet does. Well, you necessarily bring to the table, and in this case to the poem, that perspective, so that the reader is learning from you. You're imparting whatever it is that you want to impart in the poem, whatever it might be. But it is from that, there is always a power structure in a poem. Now, let's say you are a marginalized person within society and you're writing this poem. There are many ways in which whatever you write is you're going to find yourself constricted, because it feels often like your personal I and your intention will be interpreted as teaching something. And just as the first poet was teaching something from on high, even if they don't realize they are, the marginalized person is also almost forced into that type of that type of relationship, really, within the poem. The way just Charles puts it is that it's a reduction. So once the readers have sufficiently read, felt bad, felt inspired, consumed, they are awarded a broader worldview, empathy, liberality. This is a reduction. And this happens generally with all, this is just part of poetry, because you're trying to impart some, often it's wisdom in a guise of something else. So then she writes, and I recommend you read all of it because I'm not really doing it justice. Then she writes, but what if you try to stop that from happening? So we could equally and alternately, at the level of writing, form resistances or forms of barring or keeping at bay the reader, leaving them just at the door of the text. And this is where we're coming into that beautiful complexity that you find in the best poems. And she's talking specifically here about repetition. While repetition often establishes emphases, expectation, and carries within it now the implication of lyricism, it can also be used to decontextualize, pushing the reader into a critical space of imagining their involvement within the poem. So you're not being told what you think, and you're not being imparted wisdom from on high or down below. These poems defy unintelligibility, though. So it's not that they're unintelligible, rather they create an opacity that demands interrogation, questioning who is or becomes legible through the poem. And following that, if you go look at her examples that are in her playlist, what's fascinating is that there's a wide range of poems, and the most surprising to me was that Sonnet 73 by Shakespeare is in it, that time of year thou mayst in me behold. And Emily Dickinson's I Dwell in Possibility. And this was my aha moment, because I Dwell in Possibility, quickly go to my link, follow along. I Dwell in Possibility is an architecture poem. I mean that's the conceit of the poem, is that there's a I dwell in possibility, a better house than prose. There's the house of possibility, the house of poetry. And so now I'm going back to that first sonnet with the doors and the door frame and the corners and the architecture that Josh Charles describes. And I see that the Emily Dickinson poem informs Josh Charles's latest sonnet and vice versa. And then not only do the two poems blossom, but they also almost like an entire new garden comes into view. And I suppose if we're going to follow, the conceit of, the architectural form, that Josh Charles, following in Emily Dickinson's footsteps in a way, is reimagining a house of some sort and placing her poem within it, but also using the poem to describe it, which really is what poetry does, form and content. So, so there I was, thinking that I hadn't done anything and I hadn't read anything, and poor me. And it turns out that I've actually had a breakthrough, because Eleanor, you're reading poetry journals? It took COVID for me to start reading poetry journals. I'm not sure how that worked. But in any case, I hope that this whets your appetite to also look into these journals. It is possible to read parts of journals, as I point out, without necessarily spending the money. And eventually, when you do want to subscribe, in the scheme of things, it's really not a lot of money. And you get a hell of a lot for your buck. So I'll sign off now. And I want to thank you if you, if you're watching this after my brief hiatus. And I wish you all the best, and urge you to remember that the only real property is the property of the mind. And I'll see you very soon, I hope. Bye-bye.